Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar entitled The Other Pandemic, Rape and Sexual Violence in War, organized by Lord Alton of Liverpool and the Coalition for Genocide Response. My name is Evelina Ohab, and I am the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. I'm joined by my colleague, Jess Templeman, and a panel of experts that I will introduce shortly. 19th of June marks the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. The day was established by the UN General Assembly in 2015 to raise awareness of the need to put an end to conflict-related sexual violence, to honor the victims and survivors of sexual violence around the world, and to pay tribute to all those who have courageously devoted their lives to and lost their lives in standing up for the eradication of these crimes. The use of rape and sexual violence is a pandemic that is yet to be addressed. However, as it continues to be used across several conflicts, there is little hope that the crime will be addressed comprehensively, let alone prevented. Tigray, Cameroon, Myanmar, Syria and Iraq are only a few examples where predominantly women and girls have been subjected to rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war, and as a means to hurt and humiliate them and the whole communities. While women and girls are statistically the main targets of such crimes, it is also recognized that men and boys can be targeted too. And while the crime targets individuals, the crime affects the whole communities. Marking the UN Day, our panelists will raise some of the recent cases of rape and sexual violence in conflict and discuss what is urgently needed to address them, including by combating impunity at domestic and international level and providing survivors with assistance. And our panelists today are Lord Alton of Liverpool, crossbench peer at the UK House of Lords and patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response, Baroness Helena Kennedy, QC, Labour peer at the UK House of Lords and director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and also patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response, and Mr. Igor Tsvetkowski, senior advisor on reparations, Global Survivors Fund. We should have some time for Q&A, so please feel free to send over questions and we'll deal with them if the time permits. And now, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lord Alton of Liverpool.
Thank you, Evelina, and it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be sharing this platform with my distinguished colleagues this evening. In fact, thanking Dr. Ohab for organizing this with the Coalition for Genocide Response, I'd like to use my speaking opportunity to revive the idea of establishing an ad hoc tribunal for Daesh and the crimes that ISIS committed in Iraq. Over the past 5 years, I've repeatedly called for the perpetrators of atrocity crimes and genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and other minorities in northern Iraq to be arraigned before the courts. This isn't just about demonstrating our determination to seek justice for the victims, many of whom, of course, were women, but also to demonstrate to other new offenders that they may believe they can get away with blue murder, but one day they too will be held to account. There are very few weapons which liberal democracies have in their arsenal, and which can be used without inflicting more heartbreak on the beleaguered and suffering communities. But the rule of law is one such weapon and marks out our nations from those regimes led by dictators and autocrats. In 2019, taking evidence in that region in northern Iraq, I was left in no doubt about the scale of the horrors which have occurred, with Assyrians, Syriacs, Chaldeans and Yazidis suffering grievously, subjected to repeated cycles of appalling violence, including genocide. Predating Islam, these ancient peoples have been decimated in systematic campaigns to eradicate and eliminate their culture and their way of life. I was very struck in visiting a genocide site at a place called Simile to know that it was a site where Assyrians had been murdered during the genocide that accompanied the Armenian genocide. But I was particularly struck that this is one of those sites and one of those sets of experiences which Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the word genocide and who saw more than 40 of his own family killed during the Holocaust, that he had studied what had occurred at Simile. But the crime committed in the 21st century is simply to live differently from the majority, just as it was the crime at the time of the Armenian and the Syrian and other genocides in the early 20th century. But gathering evidence from survivors didn't reveal a determined international effort to bring perpetrators to justice, and I was shocked by that. Two men whose families fled from Mosul and another whose home was burnt down in Sinjar told me that no one from the international community or the governments in Baghdad or Erbil, or for that matter in Washington or London, had ever asked to meet them or to take their statements. Yet the claim is repeatedly made here in Parliament that we are collecting evidence and that perpetrators will be brought to justice. I also collected evidence from Yazidi survivors and met their spiritual leader, the late Baba Sheikh. On August the 3rd, 2014, Daesh launched a violent attack against Yazidis in Sinjar. Daesh fighters killed hundreds, if not thousands of men. The victims' mass graves continued to be discovered to this day, and recently we saw photographs of disinterred remains at last being given the dignity of reburial. On becoming British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson said that Daesh are, and I quote, are engaged in what can only be called a genocide of the poor Yazidis. And yet to this day, his government have still not recognized it as a genocide. As part of the same campaign, Daesh fighters abducted boys to turn them into child soldiers and women and girls for sex slavery. More than 3,000 women and girls are still missing and their fate unknown. Some investigations and prosecutions of the Daesh perpetrators have been conducted in some of our domestic courts. However, two main problems have emerged. First, those prosecutions conducted to date have been for lower offences, specifically for terrorism-related offences, and not for other offences such as murder, kidnapping, sale into otherwise forced marriage, trafficking in persons, rape, sexual slavery and other forms of sexual violence, recruitment, and the use of children, forced transfer of population, destruction of cultural heritage, and much more. Or for international crimes such as genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Second, the procedure surrounding such trials, especially when they've taken place in Syria or in Iraq, has been problematic. The first step towards justice was made when in September 2017, when the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2379, establishing an investigative team, UNITAD, headed by a special advisor to support domestic efforts to hold ISIS, Daesh accountable by collecting, preserving and storing evidence in Iraq of acts that may account to war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide committed by those groups to the highest possible standards, it was said. In May 2021, as recently as that, Karim Khan QC, then the special advisor and head of UNITAD, briefed the United Nations Security Council on recent developments, including UNITAD's finalized two case briefings related to attacks committed by Daesh against the Yazidi community in Sinjar 2014 and the mass killings of unarmed Iraqi Air Force cadets from Tikrit Air Academy, Camp Speker, in June 2014. Among others, UNITAD identified 1,444 suspected perpetrators responsible for the attacks against the Yazidis, including 14 members deemed most responsible for the atrocities classified as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. UNITAD further identified 20 members of Daesh most responsible for the attack on Camp Speker. UNITAD has been doing important work to ensure justice for the survivors and families, the victims, and I pay tribute to them for that. But nevertheless, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2379 identifies Iraqi domestic courts as the primary venue to deal with prosecutions. And that is problematic for several reasons. Among other problems, Iraqi domestic law doesn't criminalize such international crimes as genocide. An attempt to introduce this crime into domestic law is underway. However, the very introduction of the relevant laws doesn't mean that the Iraqi courts will be able to prosecute the perpetrators for the crime. Indeed, there are several concerns in relation to the capacity of the Iraqi judiciary system in dealing with these cases that go far beyond the need to introduce laws on genocide. They'll need to be addressed, and the international community needs to extend a helping hand to assist the Iraqi judiciary. However, as I have argued since 2016, we also need to explore other options, including the option of establishing an international criminal tribunal for Daesh in Iraq. There's an important benefit of pursuing this option that cannot be achieved with domestic proceedings, and this is to put the perpetrators on trial before the whole world, prosecute the perpetrators in accordance with the rule of law that I mentioned right at the outset, and with due process, and send a message to others that one cannot get away with genocide. Domestic proceedings in Iraq, as they are currently undertaken, cannot achieve that aim. Also, Daesh fighters come from all over the world, and so all states have a duty to work together and address the issue of impunity and to ensure justice. As such, I propose that the United Kingdom should table a new United Nations Security Resolution to establish an ad hoc tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for Daesh in Iraq, that would follow the establishment of UNITAD, and so would mirror the approach taken by the UN Security Council to the previous situations in Rwanda and in Bosnia. The jurisdiction of the proposed ad hoc tribunal would be tailored to ensure support from the UN Security Council. Its territorial jurisdiction will be limited to Iraq only. The personal jurisdiction is limited to Daesh fighters only and doesn't include, for example, any Iraqi soldiers who may have committed war crimes in the combat against Daesh. Again, the first step to collect and preserve the evidence of the atrocities by Daesh has been done. Justice is only one step away, and this step, to my mind, is an ad hoc tribunal. For the sake of those who have suffered so grievously, this is a step which we should initiate for the sake of those from northern Nigeria to Tigray to Xinjiang who are the victims of contemporary, equally appalling crimes. Let the civilized world, the world which says it believes in the rule of law and is guardian of the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide and guardian of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, demonstrate that it hasn't forgotten what motivated the promulgation of those two great edicts and provide justice to the families and loved ones of the disfiguring terrors that they have experienced in northern Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Alton, and thank you very much for emphasizing the important work done by UNITADs, but also explaining that we need to take yet another step. There's yet another step towards justice, and the step would be, for example, establishing an ad hoc tribunal to prosecute Daesh for its crimes, especially genocide and crimes against humanity against Yazidis and others in Iraq. And now I would like to give the floor to Baroness Helena Kennedy, QC.
Thank you very much, Evelina. And it's always wonderful listening to Lord Alton, David Alton, speaking about the moral imperative of us as citizens in this world who share a common humanity, to take on a sense of responsibility for the horrors that happen, that justice really matters. And David always articulates so brilliantly why we cannot be bystanders who do nothing. I want to start really by telling you a little story, which is that 2 years ago, when I became the director of the Institute of Human Rights, and I'm a practicing barrister of many years' experience at the English bar and a certain amount of experience internationally, but I had the great privilege of having lunch with Dr. Mukwege, who was one of the really important figures after the horrors that took place in the Congo now 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And he just a few years ago was given the Nobel Prize for his work in the Congo, and he's a medical doctor. He's an obstetrician gynecologist. So it's very much the area, the issue of women's health has been his commitment and his calling all his life. He was given the Nobel Prize at the same time as a wonderful young woman who was a Yazidi. Nadia was being honored for her giving voice to the horrible atrocities that took place and were experienced by the Yazidi just now spoken of by Lord Alton, and the terrible rape and sexual violence and crimes that were committed against the women of the Yazidi. The men certainly suffered, and many of them were killed and beheaded and slaughtered. And the women had seen that happening to their fathers and brothers and husbands. But they themselves were then sold into slavery and were raped time and time again. They gave birth to babies who then, of course, often have the terrible problem of not being accepted by the communities that they would otherwise belong to, because they've been fathered by an enemy people who've done the most terrible crimes to the Yazidi. So the anguish and the suffering of those women is beyond recounting. Like David, I've been to the camps where the Yazidi are currently taking refuge. I've met with many of the women and heard their accounts. And I've also met with the women who are settled in refugee camps in Syria, who basically can't return to their Yazidi families because they have the terrible decision of either abandoning their children in the camps, their babies, or staying with their children and losing their parents and their brothers and sisters. And so you can imagine the torment of that additional pain to be suffered by the women who are the sexual victims here. Now, all of you will know, I'm sure, that bringing trials in the international domain is very, very difficult. And I agree that and would join in the calling for an ad hoc tribunal, so that those who have been arrested and are currently in custody in different places, in Iraq, in Syria, some of them have been transported to the United States and to other places. But there are many people, members of Daesh, who were part of that horrible period, who could be brought to justice if there was a tribunal created, rather like the one that was created after the terrible war in Yugoslavia, and also after the Rwanda genocide. And so I do think that there are things that could be done in order to deal with that. I also would endorse the fact that it's been very difficult. The business of gathering evidence. There is now a III mechanism which was created by the United Nations, and they are slowly but surely gathering evidence together. But of course, the people who gathered evidence and who are always the best people to gather evidence are the people who are if you like, there at the beginning, the community workers, the people, and in fact, for the Yazidi women, it was women's organizations who went there to provide support, to help get counseling in and medical help to many of the women who needed medical help. And so many of the first accounts that are given by women are not given when asked, to tell us what happened. The first thing that women say when they're asked after terrible atrocities in war is they say, they killed my father, they slaughtered my brothers, they killed my husband and my children and my sons. And they describe the horror of watching mutilation and barbarity towards the people that they love. They then talk about the destruction of their homes and their burial grounds and their mosques or their places of worship or whatever. This is my experience the world over, where horrible things have happened. And what happens is that women turn last of all to their own experiences and often have to be specifically asked, did anything happen to you? Before they will talk about what they've experienced. And it's because of the shame that is borne by women still to this day, if they are the people who are victimized in a sexual way. The fact that they have been taken in a sexual way is something that they haven't even got the language for often, because of the sense of shame that they feel. And so getting evidence is very difficult. And one of the problems is, of course, that if evidence is taken, and many of the small charities and organizations and NGOs that go into war zones afterwards, and who receive these accounts in the first instance and record them, of course, have no ideas about the rules of evidence. They don't know that, in fact, to have hearsay evidence makes it problematic in certain courts. They don't know that if you show a photograph to someone and say, was this the person who did it to you? That in some ways you may be leading the witness to make an identification of someone which, where it may be a wrongful identification. And so that there are things that, in fact, can contaminate the value of evidence if it isn't taken in the right way. And so one of the things that has concerned lawyers like myself and organizations like the one that I'm involved in is about seeking to provide better training for those who will be the gatherers of evidence, so that it will be possible for tribunals to try cases in a proper way. And so it is, I think, a very important part of all of this. Unfortunately, in many of the mechanisms, the investigation that takes place prior to the prosecutions, or to even decide whether a prosecution is possible, the investigations are often not conducted in ways that bring out the best evidence. So I want to talk about why that is. And I want to first of all say that, as David has described, rape in conflict isn't new. We only have to go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey and to ancient texts and Aeschylus and the plays of ancient Greece to know about the wars and the ways in which women were treated in those wars. It was a way in which you punished nations, because, of course, by despoiling their women, by impregnating them, by ravaging them, by making them it impossible for them to procreate thereafter, because of the wounding of their bodies and their intimate parts. All of that is historic, and we know that it has always gone on. But the problem about it is that women have often been silenced in giving their accounts about these things. And shame is the thing that, of course, often operates in silencing women. And so even after the Second World War, and we know that there was serious raping after the Second World War. We know that advancing Russian armies coming into Germany raped many German women. We know that there was raping that went on inside concentration camps. But people were so profoundly ashamed. Those stories were not told, or the questions were never asked. And to some extent, that silencing of women's experience in history is still something that we're having to deal with in our own societies, the ways in which women often suffer crimes, and the systems of law have failed to address them. And of course, it's not a great surprise. Law is man-made in all of our societies. Who got to make the laws? And they were made by those who were powerful and in power. And so the rule makers get to make the rules, and they are usually the powerful. And women, of course, were not in that category. And women, of course, until comparatively recently, and still in many societies, are seen as property. They're as if they're owned by their menfolk. And therefore, if you're going to rape and pillage, you're going to actually be dealing with the stuff that your enemy might care about. And of course, women's physical disadvantage makes them particularly vulnerable. And women, as the bearers of children, of course, provide an opportunity for, as David has said, to fulfill that horror of crimes, genocide, so that you're actually seeking a form of destruction of the identity of a people. So in talking about this day, the 19th of June, which of course has now been made a great day in the United States of America, to really look at the issue of racism. But in the international field, it also bears another commemoration, and that is for the many women who have suffered in conflict and been the victims of sexual violation of the most horrific kind. Now, when I met Dr. Mukwege, to go back to my story, and had lunch with him, we spoke about what had happened in the Congo 20 years before. And he had received his Nobel Prize, and he talked about the fact that he had spent these years mending the damage that had been physically done to so many of these women. And he, of course, as I've said, is an obstetrician gynecologist. And so he was dealing with the terrible, terrible suffering of these women, the physical suffering, where he stitched and mended and sought to try to help them become whole again. And what he said was, there's no becoming whole again. And he said, I then sought out psychologists to deal with the pain, the mental anguish, the flashbacks, the post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course is only in comparatively recent times that we've come to understand the full implications of that for women who've been raped and raped again. And there was a shortage. There were no psychologists in the Congo. There was one psychiatrist, and they had to try and recruit and find people to come in to help counsel and to train some people to counsel the women and to give them an opportunity to speak about their mental anguish. And he said to me, but Helena, even when we've done that, what remains a problem for these women, and which will remain with them through their lives, is this hole that they feel in their hearts because they haven't had justice. And he said to me, I want you to help me. Those women have to have justice. And, you know, it really does remind us of why this is so important. And I've sort of, over the last 2 years since our meeting, have conjured with the idea that we have to talk to women in some of the places about what kind of justice they want. And one of the things, and I want to say how much I support the idea. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I believe that the trial process is fundamentally important in society recognizing and the world recognizing the terrible wrongs that happen. But we also have to archive the accounts of women who suffer in war in the particular way that women suffer when it's sexual violence that's used in conflict. And by doing that, we can be making it clear that this cannot be part of any war. And indeed, it should be one of the things that calls for the end to all war. And if in pursuit of peace and justice, we do anything, one of the things we have to do is to call out the terrible, terrible wrongs that are suffered by women in the course of conflicts. And we've seen it recently. David Alton and myself have had close contact with many women who are from the Uyghur community in China, who have suffered terribly at the hands of those who really want to remove the identity of the Uyghur people. The Rohingya, who again, at the hands of the military, the Myanmar military, so many of those women raped. And now in Tigray, at least 10,000 women. And I was only the other day speaking with an NGO that's working with the women who have suffered in this way. So we're not seeing a reduction of this. We're actually seeing more of it. And so it is one of the great evils in our world that we have to be prepared to talk about. And it's so hard for the women to talk about it, that we have to use our voices to bring this to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. And there's a lot to unpack from what you said, and maybe just mentioning a few important points. As you emphasize that women and girls who have been subjected to rape and sexual violence continue, do not speak up because of the stigma associated with the atrocities, and also that the pain and suffering that they suffered because of this rape and sexual violence does not stop when the rape and sexual violence stop. Those women and girls have to live with the consequences of the atrocities, and they need to be provided with adequate assistance afterwards. And last but not least, we've seen more of the atrocities over recent years. The question is, why are we seeing more cases of rape and sexual violence used as a weapon of war in so many different conflicts? And the question could be whether impunity is one of the reasons that the perpetrators are not brought to justice. And we need to address the crimes in order to maybe prevent future atrocities. This is just a question, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with that later on. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Igor Cvetkowski.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Evelina, for the introduction, and particularly for the invitation to speak at this event. And I'm particularly honored to be able to speak on the same panel with Baroness Kennedy, as well as with Lord Alton, who has been doing a lot of work on these issues, not only in relation with sexual violence in conflict, but generally human rights issues, has been one of the leading figures in terms of pushing the policy forward. I'm very grateful to both of them for giving a sort of a leeway and intro into what I was going to discuss, and I will expand a little bit more on that. And thank you, Baroness Kennedy, again for mentioning the work of Dr. Mukwege, and also the witnessing of Nadia Murad, of what happened. As Evelina introduced me, I work for the Global Survivors Fund, which was founded by Dr. Mukwege and Nadia Murad. It was founded for a particular reason, because there was a realization that the survivors of sexual violence in conflict in DRC, Iraq, but in all other places as well, they very rarely have an access to justice, not only criminal justice, but also reparative and restorative justice and care, that they really need and deserve. So this is the motivation behind Dr. Mukwege, and there's also behind, Nadia Murad, for their initiative, to establish the Global Survivors Fund, and that's where we are at the moment. The other factor for the establishment of the Global Survivors Fund, for which I work, is also the demand by the survivors themselves, because they realize at some point that the criminal justice might remain elusive for quite some time, that the accountability and finding impunity and bringing the perpetrator to justice might take some time, but they need to rebuild their lives. So there was an increasing demand over the past, I would say, even decades, by survivors from Bosnia, survivors from Congo, survivors from other locations, that there is that they need and they deserve reparations. So, and they, at the end, also they created a network which is called SEMA, where they actually very much articulate, their needs and expectations regarding various types of justice as well as care. So this brings me to one of the topics that I certainly wanted to discuss. I'm a reparation expert, and I have been working on reparations for the past 20 years. I started with the German forced labor compensation program 20 years ago, literally to the day. And then I worked in Sierra Leone, Colombia, in Sri Lanka, in Chad, in many other locations, so I will not go through it. But that's my scope. I look from the point of view of reparations. And especially I find myself in situations where I discuss with survivors and victims of sexual violence, but also other victims of other human rights violations, about what are their priorities and expectations. And in many cases, absolutely, they would say, yes, I would like to see the one who committed the crimes against me or against my family or neighbor to be brought to the court, to be investigated, to be convicted, and so and so. But they also say, I need to continue with my life. I need a justice. I need someone to take a responsibility about what happened to me. And it wouldn't be only the perpetrator, but also the state, and do something in terms of, me getting satisfaction, me getting compensation, me getting rehabilitation, me getting guarantee for non-repetition. And these are the typical forms of reparations that you find. So there is a clear demand on the side of the survivors that the justice efforts are not limited to ad hoc tribunals, to criminal justice, but they also that they are survivor-centric. And as you might have noticed, over the past couple of years, the term survivor-centric approach is something which is becoming increasingly used by policymakers, increasingly used by survivors, and even increasingly used in judicial institutions. Even the International Criminal Court now advocates and pushes for survivor-centric approach. And certainly the new prosecutor brings a lot of experience because he was able to engage with the victims, the Yazidi victims a lot in Iraq. So survivor-centric approach means also that we need to look beyond the criminal justice and look at the reparative justice. And that's for a reason, because the criminal justice has its own limitations, which are inherent to the criminal justice as it is, because not every perpetrator can be identified. Not every perpetrator who is identified can be investigated. Not everyone who is investigated will be indicted. And not everyone who is indicted will be convicted. And very few of those would actually be able or ordered or be able to pay reparations to the victims. So we see, for example, to which extent the criminal justice can be exclusive if we look at the totality of the victims. From the other side, if you look from the survivor-centric approach and look at the reparation as a mechanism, they're inclusive because it is not necessary to have the perpetrator being identified, investigated, and convicted in order for the survivors to get justice. So the basis for the formation of the Global Survivors Fund was actually to advocate on one side for instituting reparative justice mechanisms, to provide a technical assistance to those who are willing to do something about that, but they're not capable or they don't know how. And in cases where the states are not willing and capable, to actually provide interim reparative measures and therefore help the victims and sort of stimulate and engage the government. And the purpose is not, of course, to excuse the duty bearers from having a responsibility. They still have a responsibility. Perpetrators need to be prosecuted and punished, and probably also held liable for reparations. And states need to have a responsibility to do something about their citizens. So it is their responsibility. We are not taking the responsibility away. But the last point, and I can probably go on for this for quite some time. I'm happy to answer questions, but I just wanted to make one point, which I think is becoming very relevant, and that is the issue of financing reparations. In most of the cases where I have worked around the world, the first excuse that will be given by a state why they're not going to do reparations, administrative reparations, is that's horribly expensive. We don't have money. We need to reconstruct our country, and so reparations are always pushed back. So to a certain extent, that is true. Reparative programs, they're not cheap. It includes compensation, which could be quite a significant, but not necessary. So, and there are some ways how to allocate the funds which are already available within the country. But in some cases, the funds are not available, and therefore we have decided to look from the Global Survivors Fund at different mechanisms for innovative way of financing. We have looked at the issue of probably using bonds as a mechanism for social bonds as a mechanism for creating a fund for reparations. We have been discussing with governments about introducing taxation, which is directed at the industries which are related to the violations. And we are also looking at something which is very interesting and it's very timely because another round of paper was published today, and the issue of repurposing assets, which are already being seized or freezed due to sanction regimes or judicial processes, and using these assets for what actually the assets should be used, which is for providing remedy to the victims and to the survivors. So on that note, I would just like to highlight that there was a lot of work done by Hogan Lovells, we are probably familiar with, which is a UK-based law firm, and Redress, also UK-based NGO, last year, and there was one report which was published, probably proposing some ideas. And just today, together with us, with the Global Survivors Fund, and also with Goldsmith Chambers and Hogan Lovells and Redress, we published a new paper which elaborate a little bit more in detail about the international obligation to guarantee reparation on one side, and about the legal pathways for using frozen or seized assets for the purpose of reparations. So there is a lot to discuss. My point here is reparations are extremely important, they're inclusive, and they're needed by the survivors. Just as a last quote, the SRSG patent, the SRSG for Sexual Violence in Conflict, 2 years ago said that survivors of sexual violence in conflict, that reparations are what survivors of sexual violence in conflict want most but get least. And that's something that is coming from survivors. So with that, I will just close and leave the floor for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor, for explaining us the importance of reparations. And of course, we look forward to reading the paper in relation to that you just mentioned in relation to the law on guaranteeing reparations, and of course the different proposals how this could be implemented. And now I would like to give the floor to Jess to take over the Q&A.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for their very, very interesting and very thought-provoking presentations. I think my first question comes from Gillian Dare, who says, one of the many problems in Iraq and other countries, as Lord Alton mentioned, is that the recognition of PSVI-related crimes does not exist, nor do the laws to prosecute them. The international community needs to encourage these governments to adopt appropriate legislation and help them to do so. How can we best pursue this? And I think first to Baroness Kennedy on that one.
I'm keen to engage with this because I currently chair as part of the Helsinki Forum a network of women parliamentarians in the MENA region in Middle East and North Africa, and most recently, in one of our discussions, and we have a wonderful, very vibrant discussions about lawmaking, the role of women in politics, and so on. But during the COVID period, there was a great concern about the rise of domestic violence everywhere. I mean, it's happened around the world. Being contained in confined spaces has made it harder for women to address, to get help for their situations if they're being abused. And one of the things that was so heartbreaking was our Iraqi member of parliament, a really lovely woman who for 10 years has been trying to get domestic violence legislation through their parliament, and when she stands up is ridiculed. And how are women to be controlled if there's such legislation and so on, and if women if there's such things as refuges for women to flee to because of domestic violence, that put 2 or 3 women together and it will inevitably turn into a brothel, and so and this is all going to, of course, break up families and be to the detriment of a patriarchal system. So getting law through that is good for women is very hard in certain places, and it's one of the reasons why I feel very strongly that I endorse what David Alton is calling for, in that I think that there are times when you have to say, listen, you at the moment, and I'm sure that you will at some point progress to have the kind of law that is needed, but given that you currently don't have that law, it is better that an international tribunal might deal with these cases, because at the moment, of course, it's falling to Iraq, where most of the Daesh men are in prison, that it will fall to Iraq to deal with their trials. And I don't have very much confidence in that at all, given the state of law around the protection of women, the violation of women, and the ways in which evidence is measured. So I have real concerns about that. I did after the Iraq invasion, and in the when eventually the United States withdrew from Iraq, they put in money into some human rights programs, and some of them were for women. And I, after they'd gone on for a number of years, I was asked to go out as an independent assessor of those programs. And the constant thing I heard from women there was the inadequacy of law to protect them, and to protect them from all manner of abuse. And so I'm afraid that I share Lord Alton's concerns and the reasons why we should be urging, first and foremost, that there's an ad hoc tribunal created, and it's not left for the Iraq courts to deal with this, because I don't think that women will secure the kind of justice that we would want to see for them. And secondly, that we should be urging the Iraq courts to introduce the kind of law that we're talking about to protect women. And I think it's a great regret that after the invasion I regretted anyway, but a great regret to me that when they were creating a constitution and so on, that we didn't actually play a more active part in securing the rights of women at that time.
Thank you, Baroness Kennedy. I wonder if either of the other panelists wish to come in on this question. Lord Alton, I'm sure that you would wish to comment.
Well, thank you, Jess. Yes, I'd be very happy to add just a few words to what Lady Kennedy has said. Helena's right about the inadequacy of the Iraqi courts, but we have got to try and build them up. And I was careful to say in my remarks that I feel that in addition to creating an ad hoc tribunal, which would enable us to fast track and move on at an accelerated pace the prosecution of people against whom we now have the collected evidence. I think that in addition to that, we've got to build up the Iraqi courts for the future. As Helena knows, I'm very proud of my daughter. Aren't all fathers, probably, but she, along with another young barrister, set up a charity that's working in Uganda. It's called Evolve, and I think the name of the charity gives the game away. But you start from where you are, and they're building up local lawyers. They're building up the court system. They're working with judges. I've met some of the judges who have been brought to London, and these are people who, for the future, are going to do great things. And I think we should adopt the same kind of approach in Iraq. But for the moment, I think that the International Tribunal is not a case of one or the other. I think you have to do both. There hasn't been jurisprudence in Iraq that would enable the kinds of cases that we're talking about to be tried there anyway. I mean, they didn't even have a word for genocide in the Arabic tongue. So this is something that they've had to put their own minds around. And we do know that because of the nature of the society that Saddam Hussein had created, that it was a disfigured society and that it hasn't massively improved in some respects since. And the position of women in Iraq is one that should still continue to concern us, although there are now more women who speak openly and are able to think more freely and aloud without facing appalling consequences, who are now members of the Iraqi parliament. So I would think that there would be value in creating more links between things like the Interparliamentary Union, for instance, and UK parliamentarians to befriend, to mentor, to encourage in order to build up that kind of presence. But you think about some of the things that Daesh did. I mean, the enslavement of women was appalling. The burning down, the confiscation of people's properties, the painting of the letter N for Nazarene on Christians' homes so that those who then refused to convert would either be hounded out of their homes or worse. Gay people being thrown off of balconies because of their sexual orientation. I mean, this is a society that has disrespected a majority, women and minorities of the kind that I've just been describing. So there's a long way to go. And the caricatures, of course, that get into the culture, the caricatures of Yazidis, which, I mean, Igor may want to say more about this, but, these are devil worshippers. That was the view of Yazidi people. It was a complete distortion of who they are and what their ancient religion was and is about. But it's a bit like the blood libel against Jewish people that Christians were responsible for in former times and led to so much anti-Semitism. I think that if you want to caricature a minority and you want to distort the way that they are perceived, then that's how you tend to start. There's one other thing I would mention, which was that when I went to Erbil, I met with the wonderful woman who is the Speaker of the Kurdish Parliament. And Kurdistan is like an oasis in many respects inside Iraq. And one of the reasons for that is thanks to the United Kingdom, because it was John Major's government that put a no-fly zone in during Saddam Hussein's days. And Kurdish people will say to you, you saved our lives. This was after the terrible things that he had done using chemical weapons at Halabja against Kurdish people. And so they have not forgotten the lesson that it was a democratic, liberal society, a country that had no huge vested interests at stake, but who came to their rescue at that time. So I was very struck by the conversations I had with the Kurdish parliamentarians, and they accepted one point that I made, and I thought I had to make, which is that if you have the death penalty, as they do still in Iraqi law, then personally, as someone who opposes the use of the death penalty, it would worry me that some of these courts could end up becoming like, as it were, lynch mobs, lynch courts, where people would end up being executed at the end of it. And I don't think that's the development of the kind of jurisprudence that we want to see. So I think we have to be honest in the way that we discuss these things, but we do have carrots. I mean, our aid program, when we're not massively reducing it, but it has been used to build up all sorts of long-lasting judicial institutions in many parts of the world, which this country can be very proud of. And I think restorative justice, again, Igor will want to talk about this more, I think that is a crucial element of how our aid programs should be used, and the sooner it's returned to 0.7%, I think the better it will be for all of us. That's a different subject for a different webinar on a different day, Jess, but I hope that that helps to complement some of the things that Helena said.
Thank you, Lord Alton. Igor, I would love to give you the chance to also comment on this issue.
Well, I mean, very briefly, I mean, I have faced, the same resistance in many countries when I was talking about transitional justice and reparations. And in many countries, you would have resistance to introduction of new norms, new standards, new languages, new rights, new normatives, and so on. And the reasons for this are various, So you will have the cultural differences, of course, because in certain countries you wouldn't have the notion of reparation would be simply translated to compensation, and it's really difficult, to expand it beyond. There would be political also reasons, in some countries, people because of politics would not like to recognize that, the victims have a right to certain violation which they deny it happened. And then there is also, in many cases, there are the, sort of pushbacks which are coming from the professionals in the area. In many cases, I have met with the judges, who, from any country, I mean, I think that would happen, not necessarily in countries who have undergone conflict and so, or where the rule of law is weak, but in any other country where the judges would push back and said, no, I'm sorry, you cannot introduce a new mechanism here. You cannot circumvent the judicial process and institute administrative reparations because, we are professionals. We have been doing this for years. We have our laws as they are at the moment. We have our constitution, and that's also when the question of sovereignty comes in, and so on and so. So it is always a challenge to work with states and the governments and to convince them, that they need to move away perhaps from the practice that they are very familiar with. And it's not easy, and there could be different incentives. And I'm glad that Lord Alton mentioned that, yes, international aid could be an incentive, but I mean, I think perhaps, policymakers and states should consider also different measures. I'm not saying that, states should be sanctioned if they don't do restorative justice programs, but, there should be perhaps UN mechanisms which should closely monitor whether they fulfill their obligations toward their own citizens, in one or another way. So maybe that's also, a way to think, it is something that we want to bring to the UN and ask, and create a mechanism which will hold states responsible for instituting and implementing reparative programs. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Evelina, I believe you wish to comment.
Yes, very, very briefly. Of course, we've heard from Baroness Kennedy about the international tribunals. We've heard from Lord Alton about the importance of strengthening Iraqi courts and Iraqi judiciary to be able to deal with such prosecutions. But I just wanted to mention as well that 2 years ago, the UK government accepted a recommendation 21B of the Bishop of Truro Review. And this recommendation says that the government should look into the options of prosecuting Daesh fighters for rape and sexual violence, rather than only for terror-related offenses. And it's been 2 years, and we have not heard how the government is going to do that. So of course, there is still 1 year till the UK government is reviewed for its implementation of those different recommendations. And I think this is something that the government should really look into and ensure that there are effective mechanisms and effective ways of dealing with the issue, whether using the universal jurisdiction or indeed supporting the proposal that Lord Alton is advocating for. But ultimately, at this stage, nothing is happening in relation to this recommendation from what we've seen. So this is yet another avenue for justice that has to be explored. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question here from a participant, or I do not have your name, I'm sorry, I only have your email address, which I will not read out to everyone on the call, but it's a question for Igor saying, when you look at the content of reparation programs and the form of reparations, are there any specific forms that you would identify as being under-included, which are of particular relevance for repairing the harms from sexual and gender-based violations, and which ones would you prefer to see prioritized?
I mean, thank you very much, Erin, for this question. I can recognize who asked the question. Yes, I mean, there are certainly, you know, some aspects, some types of reparations, some forms of reparations which have been neglected, you know, and they have been neglected because of the lack of funding and finances. So it brings me back again to the issue that I was discussing before. So compensation certainly is, you know, I mean, we tend to think, you know, that victims, they don't need money, that the justice should not be buy-off for the crimes that were committed, etc. But that's not necessarily true. Survivors need money. Survivors need rehabilitation. Survivors need satisfaction in order to be able to move forward. You know, so in a situation where the funding is scarce, you know, states or courts or institutions would rather go for sort of soft type of reparations, symbolic reparations, acknowledgement, recognition, and so on. So maybe some psychosocial support, and maybe some livelihood linked to development, you know. But in reality, you know, there wouldn't be anything which is being delivered which is sustainable. And the most sustainable way to help a survivor of sexual violence in conflict, for example, would be to ensure a monthly pension throughout the life. Now, that's a very difficult thing. It is not cheap thing, but if you look at what would really help survivors, how to move forward, would be that they have their status restituted, and that they have their life secured for the rest of their life. So that's what we owe the victims, but it is really difficult to achieve. So that, yeah, I hope that answers the question, Erin's question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and you did guess the name correctly. Thank you, Erin, for putting it in. I think we've got a couple of minutes, and if you don't mind, I actually might just ask very quickly each of the panelists to say their one thing that they believe would make the biggest difference. If you could change one thing in the world tomorrow, blue sky thinking, what do you think would be the biggest, would produce the biggest change for the victims of these crimes, and what would you like to see happen? So first, Lord Orton, I'll come to you.
Oh, well, given what Helena and I have been saying this evening, it's not just about the terrible things that have happened historically to the Yazidis or going right back to all these other cases. It's what's happening now in Tigray. It's what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs. It's what's happening to the Rohingya in Burma. And you see time and again that the big powers, especially China, but to some extent Russia as well, use their vetoes at the Security Council to prevent any of these cases being referred to the International Criminal Court. I want to see international justice, and I don't believe that can happen until the ICC and the other instruments that we have are made to work effectively. So I'd like to see the veto system overhauled and removed so that where atrocity crimes are reported to the Security Council, it is not possible to use a veto to prevent them from being heard by international courts.
Thank you, Lord Orton. Baroness Kennedy, to you.
Oh, listen, if we had wish lists, those are the wishes that one would want, that one could, at the snap of one's fingers, reform the United Nations to make it more sensible, and these vetoes disappear. If one could have one wishes, we would be able to introduce just law around the world, in which women were not treated as property, in which women were not treated as secondary, and women were not given a sort of second-class form of justice, even when it is available. And so those wishes, if one had a wand, would be for me. But I'm very taken with what Igor says about the importance of helping people who have been the survivors of these terrible events to make a life thereafter. And I think the world owes that to them. And so I would like to see human rights becoming a priority ahead of trade. I would like to see us not forget that people have to live and survive afterwards, and that there are ways in which we in the privileged world could make that happen. So I would like us to put our hands in our pockets and help create a survivors fund.
Thank you, Baroness Kennedy. Igor, to you for the final word.
Well, just, you know, at the end, I would like to say that the conflict of sexual violence is not something that is happening only between the victim and the perpetrator. You know, it's not a zero-sum game between the two. It's not a binary relationship. We are all complicit in a certain way. We are not responsible for what happens to them, but we are all complicit, and we all have a responsibility toward the survivors. You know, so I think, you know, this is a notion that we need to sort of accept at the individual level, also at the state level, globally. Because injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I think, you know, we should try to remedy that, not only at the national level, but do our utmost also at the international level through various mechanisms. That would be all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I'll hand back to Evelina.
Thank you very much, Jess. And I would like to say a big kudos to all our panelists for their presentations today, but also for the incredible work that they've been doing for many, many years. And of course, a big kudos to the team for organizing this important event. And I think this event has been definitely very special because we have a few very concrete proposals how to address rape and sexual violence, how to address the atrocities, whether to combat impunity for the crimes, or whether to address the issue of the lack of assistance to the survivors. So I hope that over the next weeks, months, we'll look into how we can implement those proposals and make them reality. So I definitely look forward to seeing how this can be done. So thank you very much for joining us today. And hearing from our wonderful panelists, and I'll be in touch soon in relation to our future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelina.